Hey everyone, it's Evan Kirstel. Great discussion today with the legendary Byron Reese, futurist, technologist, entrepreneur, bookseller, book author. Did I catch it all there, Byron, or what say you?
Pretty much. Sounds like you were like briefed by my mom or something.
Well, that would be nice. But we have spoken in the past, and I'm a big fan of you and your work, which is why I'm excited to chat about your new book. Tell me more about stories, dice, and rocks that think how humans learn to see the future and shape it. That's quite a title, so it needs some deciphering, I
Sure.
think, at least on my part.
I wrote this book to answer a question which I had, which is why are people different than animals? You know, people always want to say we're just another animal, but if you look around, it sure doesn't look like that. It sure looks like we live completely different lives than, say, badgers or something, right? We have cities and literature and all these things, and it's like, well, what makes us so different? And that was how this all began. That I tried to do it, and really, what I found is that it turned out to be a story of how we first got this ability to see two things that don't actually exist: the future and the past. Animals don't know there's a future and a past. That's been pretty well studied, actually, but we do, and because we know there's a future, we can actually draw on specific things in the past to inform what we do. And that's the stories. We learned how to tell ourselves stories, which may only be about the next 30 seconds. So, like, I could do this. I could go up behind that mountain and climb the back, or I could do this, or I could do that. And we did these stories. And that was the first section of the book. It's in three parts. The second one is it said, well, now that we can imagine the future, how do we predict it? It's about how do you make a science for predicting the future. And to do that, you have to understand why the future happens the way it does. And so this whole middle section, dice, is about probability and the invention of probability, which sounds like chloroform in print, I will grant you, but it's just full of stories about how people's thinking had to change. And then final section, rocks that think. It's a metaphor for silicon chips for computers, and a rock that thinks. And what happened is, while section 2 began in 1652 when we started to decipher probability, this one begins in 1952 with the invention of the first transistor computer and it being turned on. And this is where we have learned how to just put bluntly, do it all at scale. Like no longer do we have to perform our calculations on paper and be limited by that. We build machines that can do that thinking for us. And so that's what the story is all about. That's the title. But if you want to, we can back up and go back through that slower, or if you can dive into any part of it you like.
Yeah, I'd love to understand your process as well as a writer. What was the spark for the book? Where did the big idea come from? How long have you been working on it?
I write a book a year, so I've been I worked on it for a year. It's always kind of anticlimactic to say where you got the spark. I could say most of my books I write a chapter at a time, not knowing how they're all going to go together. But I can pin this one back to watching the Werner Herzog documentary on the caves at Chauvet, the cave paintings at Chauvet. And I think what I learned in that I did not know is that those are among the oldest pieces of cave art we have. And I would have assumed, if you were to say, how did cave art develop over time? I would have assumed it was like, well, I bet a long time ago they were just stick figures on the wall. Then maybe they put a little triangle for a dress, and but it didn't happen that way. For some strange reason, our oldest art is beautiful beyond belief. And it's not just that it's beautiful, it's technically excellent, because whoever painted those walls, they had to build scaffolding because it's up high, and they had to illuminate it because oftentimes they're a mile deep into the cave. And they didn't and they used animal fat as an adherent. They used talc as an extender, and then they didn't even like that the source they had for black, charcoal, wasn't dark enough for them. They wanted blacker blacks, and so they used a mineral that could only be obtained 140 miles away and then processed at great technical skill. And so somehow this big mystery, which is how in the world did we go from nothing? Like the archaeological record before that is just empty. And then kapow. And it's as if we were bitten by a radioactive spider. So I wrote that chapter about like what happened to make us different. In fact, if I can, I would like to tell a story about, I would like to contrast that to an older group of creatures called Homo erectus. So Homo erectus is this creature that lived for 1.6 million years. Well, I mean, not any given erectus. As a species, they lived 1.6 million years. And they had one tool called a Shulian Hand Axe. It looks kind of like a great big arrowhead with a curved bottom, like a teardrop. And that was their tool. Now, what happened is they lived for 80,000 generations and they roamed 3 continents. And so we find these things all over the place. And there's so many of them, you can buy one on eBay. An actual tool used 1 million years ago for like $100. Now, here's the big ta-da about that. All of the Shulian hand axes are the same, no matter whether we find them in Asia or Africa or Europe, whether they were made 1 million years in or 1 million years after that. Like if I showed you 2 side by side, found on 2 continents 1 million years apart, you wouldn't be able to tell which was the older one. And so what does that tell us? I think what it tells us is that that was not a cultural object. That was not a technological object. That was a genetic object. Just like a bird only knows how to make one nest, and wherever they go, they make that nest, and beavers only know how to make one kind of dam. That's what they make. Erectus wasn't like us. Erectus just made that instinctually. You know, if you put a recording of music, of water running in the middle of a field, and a beaver walks by, beaver will build a dam around it. I mean, beaver doesn't know what it's doing when it builds a dam. It's just doing what it's programmed to. And that's what Erectus did. For 80,000 generations, nobody looked at that thing and said, I bet it would be better if. And then you think about us, and it took us, 3 generations to get from Kitty Hawk to the moon. And you see, we are a different thing than those. And that is section 1 of the book about how.
What a way to start the discussion. I love that you started with cave art and creativity and art in general. Now like fast forward, millennia to now, and I have my Dolly 2 account creating art based on ideas that I give it, and fantastic art. I mean, art that's incredible. So what can we take away from that, from the cave paintings?
So if it were just the cave paintings, it would be a little mysterious, but concurrent with the cave paintings, we find the oldest musical instruments, flutes, sometimes in the oldest caves that have this art. And then at this exact same time in other caves, we find the first representations, symbolic representations of like people or animals, like a carved figurine or something. And so you got the whole package at once. And I think, I'm not alone in this, but I think that what happened 70,000 years ago, I think probably happened to one person one day, at 3:15 on some Thursday afternoon. They had this mutation that gave them the ability to use language. And what's important about that is not using language to communicate. That came much later. The real purpose of language was it's how we think. We think in language. And that's more than just idle speculation. There's a quote in the book from Helen Keller, and who talks about what her mental life was like before her teacher came. And she said she didn't realize she was a thing that was different than the universe. She didn't realize she was an entity. She didn't realize, that didn't have any concept of time. And she says, only when I got language did I become conscious. And I think that's what happened to us. I think we got this little mutation, and it probably is a little mutation, because you think about chimps. They're 99.9% identical to our DNA, but we're very different from them. We live twice as long. We don't have as many muscles. We have different cognitive powers, and yet we're virtually identical genetically. It's just some little something, some little spark that we got. Everybody at this point that I talk to about the book makes a remark about aliens. About that point, it's like, and it is apt, because it's almost as if aliens changed us or something. I mean, it's that stark. Obviously, I don't think that, but it's that stark of a thing that demands that kind of an explanation.
Fascinating. So how do you make the leap from Act 1 to Act 2 to the Enlightenment? And you talk about 17th century France and the mathematical framework known as probability theory. What dots were you trying to connect there?
So here, all of a sudden, we get language. And when we get language, we can think in language, and then we can think in stories. And that's most of what we still use language for today. Like moment by moment, as you're merging into traffic or trying to exit or deciding what to eat, you're telling yourself these little stories. None of them, Spielberg's not going to option any of them to make a movie or anything, but they're all these little stories. So then I get to asking, like, well, how could we predict the future? And that's a very different thing. And I actually have a visual aid I would like to show, if that's allowed.
Please, yeah, just use the screen share feature, and
it's going to be on the camera.
Okay,
so
perfect.
Imagine why the future unfolds the way it does. Like, go back a few hundred years. Why would people have thought that it did? Well, perhaps the future is fated to happen. Somebody wrote it, that was written. Or there was something else called the doctrine of necessity that had to happen. A led to B, led to C, led to D. It just couldn't have. The future can't happen any other way but that way. If you rewound the universe to the Big Bang and hit play again, you'd stub your toe this morning on your bed again, because it just couldn't happen. And then the other ones are synchronicity, and that says that all these things are connected. Have you ever wondered, like, why people believe astrology? Not why they believe it, but by what mechanism do they think that works? Or by what mechanism reading chicken entrails? I mean, these were not foolish people. Why did they think reading chicken entrails gave them some insights into the future? And it's because of the connectedness of everything else. So on and on, the book talks about different ways people conceptualize the future. What they never thought of was that the future happens randomly, and because they didn't really have a notion of randomness. But more interestingly, they didn't have a notion that there was predictability in randomness. And that's what we never knew. So this is called a Galton Box. You may have seen a Galton board. You may have seen something like this at a science museum. Let me get it situated where I want it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip it, and all these beads are going to start falling. And when they fall, they're going to, each BB is going to hit a piece of plastic. And it can bounce to the left or the right with equal preference. And then it hits another piece of plastic. It can bounce to the left and the right with equal preference. And every time you do it, you're going to get that shape. Look at that.
Normal distribution.
Exactly. Who would have ever thought that if something as random as that gives us that output?
See, I remembered my middle school math here, or whatever it was.
And that's about right. Like, you brought your permission slip on field trip day to go to the science museum. That's what nobody, and here's the crazy thing is that people started finding things in our life, in our world, that also did that shape. And when you say, well, wait a minute, that is a shape of randomness, does that mean fundamentally that it's randomness that rules the world? Now, if somebody had asked me a year ago, if I flip a coin 1,000 times, how many times is it going to come up heads? I've only been trained to answer that 500, but I don't really know that, right? Like, I've never done it. And if I had not been trained to say 500, what I would have said is, who knows? 500, then maybe the next time 200, then maybe the next time 800. But in truth, the odds that it's going to be less than 400 heads or more than 600 are one in many, many billions. It's never happened in like the whole history of the universe. And that's like, oh my gosh, how can you say something that definitive about something as random and independent as coin tosses. And so what we learned to do is harness that predictability and randomness. We learned how to harness it to predict the future. And that's section 2.
Section 2. Wow. So I'm not even going to talk about quantum computing, because now you're really going to blow my mind with some of the quantum effects of randomness but let's before we get to quantum computing, let's go into just the beginning of the silicon semiconductor world and the invention of the computer chip. I mean, now it seems such a big deal, but how do you connect all these events together? Like, why was that so profound in retrospect?
For billions of years of the history of life on this planet, we've only had one place to write down information. That's in our DNA. And it takes a long time to write something. It's pretty reliable once it gets written, but it takes a long time to write it. Then one day we got language, and language became words or thoughts in our brain, and that became our DNA. Because I could say to you, don't eat the purple berry, and you'd be like, okay, I won't eat the purple berry. And that didn't take us 10 million years. I just had to say that. And then that spreads like a mutation through all of that. And then, though, here's what's really became interesting, is we then got writing about 3,000 years ago, and then that became our DNA. All the world's writing became our DNA. A lot of it is junk DNA, just like in your body, but that's what it all is. A man named Leonard Read wrote an essay a long time back in the 40s or 50s called I, Pencil. And he talks about how nobody on the planet knows how to make a pencil.
Oh, it's a classic. I think there's even a YouTube video for you kids. Go watch it on YouTube, I, Pencil. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's nobody who knows how to mine the ore, to get the iron, to make the steel, to crimp the ferrule, nobody can do it. And yet pencils get made. Of course, in our world, we could think about a smartphone, right? Like your body has 30 different elements in it. A smartphone has 60. There's nobody in the world who knows how to make a smartphone. And so how do they get made? Well, they get made, I think, by a creature I call Agora. It's a superorganism of humans, and its DNA is all the books and all the internet. And that thing knows how to make smartphones. That knows how to make them. And it does. It cranks them out. And all of that supply chain and everything else. So you then start saying, well, what would come next? And so it's kind of like the story of humanity, I think, has been one of like, 2 steps forward and 1 back, because most of what we've ever known has been forgotten, right? Like if you figured something out back in antiquity and then you died and that was it, or maybe you told somebody and then they died, or they misremembered it, or they just didn't agree with it, or whatever. That's most of our history. And because of that, we actually operate with very little knowledge base behind us, because I mean, to our grandchildren, it's going to look like we just waltz through life like drunken sailors on shore leave, just making decisions. That looks like, I like the building at that university. I'll go there. Like we just make, I'll eat there. They have a neon sign or whatever, right? Like we just make these capricious decisions. But imagine if we used all these machines to record everything everybody did, to basically instantiate the knowledge base of humanity, so that everything you try and succeed at, or everything you try and fail at, that becomes data that can inform somebody else's decision in the future. Imagine if like every decision you made actually had 100 years worth of empirical data about every person in the country and what they did and what the outcome was. You could all of a sudden imagine that you get a system that is better at suggesting what you should do than you. I mean, I liken it to a metal detector, right? Like if you buy a metal detector and you go to the beach and you're walking around swinging it and it goes beep, 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 beep. Look, you can dig anywhere you want to on that beach. If it were me, I would dig underneath the part where the metal detector went beep, beep, beep. I mean, I could dig a mile away if I wanted to, but why would I? So we built the machine to advise us on what to do, and ultimately we decide. But you have to wonder why I would want to dig elsewhere. And so I think over time, this system will inform our decisions, and we'll have the capacity. Every person on this planet will be wiser than anyone who has ever lived, because they have the accumulated knowledge and wisdom of all of their actions and their outcomes.
Wow, this is mind-blowing. Some people are, of course, going to see this as terrifying and dystopian and science fiction. Others will see it as enlightening, but we're always divided on everything. So what else would you expect?
I mean, look, there's a chapter called "What Could Possibly Go Wrong" that, isn't a fun read, right? Like these exact, like if you build a system that can measure what your eye tracks to and whether it dilates or not, and everything you look at, and every time your heart beats, and every breath you take, that can be used to do anything you want. You could control dissidence or whatever. It's going to happen though. Not. I don't think it's going to be like a Big Brother thing. What I think is going to happen is somebody's going to come out with a skillet that can detect botulism. And I'll go buy that skillet because I don't want to get sick. And somebody's going to make a toothbrush that will tell you if you're coming down with the cold because it's collected. But all of those things are collecting data. And then why would we not use that data to make better decisions in the future?
No, it's fascinating. So let's fast forward, to the present day. State, you're known as an AI, practitioner and industry expert, analyst, etc. Are you underwhelmed or excited about where we are with state-of-the-art AI, whether it's GPT-3 or Dolly 2 or practical applications? Are you disappointed we haven't made more progress, or are you just super excited about this trajectory we're on?
I will preface my comments that I hold an extreme minority view on this question.
Great. Well, I love it.
I don't want to represent it as that I'm speaking for the industry. I used to host a podcast called Voices in AI, and I had 110 people on it who I was fortunate because AI is still nascent enough that you can get a lot of people who were amazing people, because they're all still around and they're all still practicing. And every one of them, I would ask them if they thought general intelligence was possible.
AGI, yep.
Yes. I guess for your listeners, they probably know the distinction, but just for the few, when we say AI, artificial intelligence, we actually mean one of two very different things. It's very confusing. It's kind of like bi-monthly, or bi-weekly, right? That can mean twice a week, or it can mean every other week. And there's the difference between.
Most confusing term ever, yes.
I'm afraid artificial intelligence is like that. So there's something we call artificial intelligence, which is narrow, which basically is artificial intelligence that's designed to do just one thing. And it's a pretty simple technology. It basically says, get a bunch of data about the past, study it looking for patterns, and use those patterns to make predictions into the future. And it only works on things where the future is like the past. But that's how your spam filter operates, and that's how you get routed through traffic and all of that. But there's this other theoretical kind of artificial intelligence called general intelligence. That's an AI that can do what you and I can do. It's creative and all that. That is C-3PO out of Star Wars. That's Commander Data out of Star Trek. That's that woman in Ex Machina. That's Scarlett Johansson's character in Her. And that's something we don't know how to build. I think everybody would agree with that. We don't know how to build that. And so I would ask everybody, do you think we're going to get it? And in all those guests, I only had 3 ever say, no, it's impossible. And that's what I believe. I believe it to be impossible. It's all based on a notion that, and I would say my guests would agree with this, it's all based on the notion that people are machines. And if people are in fact machines, then someday we're going to build a mechanical human, and that will happen. But I don't actually think people are machines. And you don't actually have to go like straight to the soul or something immaterial to hold the view that people are not things that can be produced in fabs. We have these brains we don't understand. They give rise to these minds we don't understand. And the minds in turn give us consciousness where we can experience the universe, not just measure it. A thermometer can measure temperature, but it can never feel warmth. And you can feel warmth. And we don't know how we do that. In fact, I will go so far as to say we don't even have a theory of matter whereby consciousness is something that's why it's so vexing. Science isn't particularly bothered by things we don't know. Lots of things we don't know. But science is bothered by this question because our understanding of the nature of reality means that a rock cannot experience the world, and neither should you be able to. And that's so I don't believe we're going to make general intelligence, which I think is for the best. There, if we did nothing but narrow AI, if we stopped all development on it, it's probably going to take us 30 years just to do what we know how to do today. We're that far behind. Like what we know how to do versus what we've been able to get done, we're way behind. And so
that's a great answer. And
okay.
I mean, I'm absorbed with all the very practical, useful utilities of narrow AI, whether it's there's a dog barking and you're not hearing it because the system is listening and canceling out the noise, or whether it's GPT creating a blog for me, or Dolly 2 creating a new logo. I mean, these are here today and they're just so impactful without having AGI. So it's all good. So I guess when it comes to the sentient bot, that the Google researcher who declared his chatbot was sentient, and you think that was an illusion or misunderstanding of what sentience is?
Both. I mean, yes, both. I mean, I don't. People say sentient when usually I think they mean sapient. Sapient is smart, intelligent. That's why we're Homo sapiens. We're the smart people. But sentient means we can feel. We have senses. We experience things. So I don't believe it was either sapient or sentient.
Really interesting. So you don't think that bot could have passed a Turing test, or is a Turing test kind of out of date as far as a
well?
benchmark?
I think it's an interesting milestone in that language is hard. If you build a machine that can quote unquote understand it as well as a human, then that's an achievement. I think about Danny Hillis. He was a guy who started thinking machines. He did the big clock. Anyway, he's this super smart guy, and he once made a computer out of Tinker Toys and yarn that never lost a game of tic-tac-toe. Okay?
That's fantastic.
Never lost a game of tic-tac-toe. Now, you could build a Turing test that says, okay, are you playing a person or a machine in tic-tac-toe here? Now, that computer you wouldn't be able to tell. It plays it just like a human. But because that thing can play tic-tac-toe as well as a human, I don't think it crosses some, metaphysical threshold that makes it something different. And that's what the Turing test is. It says, hey, if you can build a machine that can master language as well as a human, then, well, you've done something. But it isn't, I don't think, particularly metaphysically interesting. It's not like it changes my view of what I am or what it is.
Right. Fascinating. Well, look, as always, you have amazing anecdotes and stories. You're just an incredible storyteller. And I'd encourage everyone to go to Amazon and buy the book. What is it, $15 on Kindle? It's what a bargain. That's a couple of coffees at Starbucks. So check it out. Thanks so much, Byron, for joining us and for sharing your insights. A book a year. That is so impressive. What's next? You want to give us a sneak peek into what your next book is?
I'd be happy to. I mentioned this superorganism Agora, the superorganism of humans. This next book asks, what is Agora? Because it could be one of three things. It could just be a metaphor. It could just be a metaphor for understanding the division of labor and how we're able to do more as a group than we are individually. Or it could be a system, like a car or something. It's not alive, but it can break or it can work or not work. Or it could be a living creature, maybe even a conscious one that that just like you are, because if I took you apart a cell at a time and put those cells in like petri dishes, they could continue to live a little while, but you would vanish. You would vanish when it was done. And then the question is, well, were you even there? Like, what are you? And that's what I think Agora is. It's like, what is it that is the equivalent of you that emerges when all these humans do all of these things? And that's this book.
Fantastic. Well, that's going to be a blockbuster as well. Thanks so much. Thanks for joining us, and stay cool in Austin if that's even possible these days. And I look forward to actually reading the book. I haven't read it yet, so I encourage everyone else to read it as well. Well, thanks, Byron. As always, brilliant chatting.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Take care, sir.